just a minute earlier. Something utterly unbelievable had been uncovered inside Rick Ness's cabin. Something so strange that everyone who witnessed it struggled to explain what they had seen, or even understand what had truly happened, before exploring the discovery that left Rick completely stunned. The video urges viewers to like and subscribe for more updates, promising that what follows is something the cameras of Gold Rush never captured. The discovery was never supposed to take place at all. The cabin itself had been assumed to be empty, securely locked, and effectively forgotten once the mining season ended. Yet only moments ago, as Rick and his crew approached the cabin again, a mysterious noise came from inside, a low, dull thud that made the entire group freeze. What they uncovered when the door was finally opened would change everything they thought they knew. The atmosphere around Rick's cabin had felt off from the moment he woke up that morning. He noticed that the silence outside wasn't ordinary. It felt heavy, almost physical, pressing against his skin as if the entire world were holding its breath. The sun was still struggling to break through the thick mist that hovered over the open ground surrounding the cabin. Rain from the night before had soaked the earth so deeply that even the lightest step would leave a print far deeper than usual. The mud around the cabin was soft and quiet, swallowing sound. No one had expected Rick to return so soon because the crew had wrapped up weeks earlier, and Rick himself had left abruptly after the season ended, claiming he needed time away to think and reset. Now, standing in front of that familiar cabin, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. The cabin door was still closed, yet the lock looked twisted, barely noticeable but enough to make anyone's chest tighten with suspicion. The trees surrounding the cabin stood unnervingly still. Even the birds that usually chirped around that area were strangely absent. Only the wind moved, gliding across the roof with a low hum that didn't make the moment feel any better. One of Rick's crew members finally broke the silence, though no one remembered later exactly who spoke first. He muttered that it looked like someone had entered the cabin. The words were shaky and uncertain, but they hung in the air long enough for everyone's mind to fill in the rest. Rick didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the cabin with narrowed eyes and tightly pressed lips. He had spent years working close to that spot, yet in that moment it felt unfamiliar, almost hostile, as if the land itself did not want him there. He dragged his hand along the wooden railing of the porch. The wood was cold and damp, but beneath that moisture was a layer of fine dust, far more than there should have been if the cabin had been left only a few weeks earlier. A faint smell lingered in the earthy metallic, and unpleasantly close to the scent of rot, just strong enough to churn a man's stomach when the breeze hit at the wrong angle. Rick's eyes shifted toward the small window on the side of the cabin. The curtain was half drawn, but a thin strip of darkness peeked through the gap. On the soft ground near the porch steps were shallow, irregular impressions, not quite boot prints, yet not animal tracks either. It looked as though something heavy had been dragged across the dirt toward the cabin door, then abruptly stopped. Rick's heartbeat picked up. The rest of the crew stared at him, waiting for him to decide the next step. No one said it aloud, but each man silently feared the same thing, that someone, or something, might still be inside. Rick reached for the door handle but hesitated, not because the metal was cold, but because something deep inside told him to be careful. He glanced at the men behind him, searching their faces for any sign of reassurance or warning, but none of them moved or spoke. A sudden breeze stirred, carrying with it the faint creak of wood from inside the cabin. Every instinct told Rick to turn around and leave. Yet another forced curiosity, responsibility, or something he couldn't name kept him rooted where he stood. He leaned closer to listen but heard only the oppressive silence, so heavy that it made his ears ring. He lingered at the door for what felt like forever, torn between fear and the urge to uncover the truth. And then the decision was made for him. A sudden dull thud sounded from inside the cabin, not loud, but sharp enough to slice through the dead stillness. One of the men whispered Rick's name, but Rick didn't move. His hand hovered above the handle, trembling slightly. Every breath felt painfully loud while something inside that cabin shifted once again. After what felt like minutes, though only seconds had passed, Rick finally pushed the door open. It groaned deeply as if resisting, sliding across the frame, like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust spiraled through the pale, light spilling into the room, clinging to the edges of tools and old furniture as though time had frozen everything in place. The very first detail Rick noticed was the floor. Something dark and sticky was smeared across the wooden planks. The substance caught the light with a faint, unnatural glimmer. Rick crouched and touched it with caution. It wasn't mud or dirt from outside. The texture was soft and clinging, leaving a residue on his fingertips that made his stomach twist. The men behind him muttered nervously, their voices small and weak. The strange metallic smell outside was stronger inside the cabin, twisting into something acidic and unsettling. Rick scanned the room carefully. A chair was lying on its side in a spot where it couldn't have fallen naturally, its legs leaving fresh scratches across the floorboards, as if dragged roughly. The fireplace was stone cold, yet the ashes had been scattered haphazardly in a pattern that didn't look random, almost as if someone had tried to bury something beneath them. As Rick gathered these details mentally, A faint sound reached him, a light scratching coming from the far corner behind the stacked crates and barrels. Rick froze. He didn't move or speak. He simply listened. The air in the room felt thicker, almost suffocating, while the men behind him shuffled anxiously. The scratching came again, followed by a soft thump that echoed through the tight space. Though the sound was subtle, the tension in the room made it feel overwhelmingly loud. Rick inched forward toward the corner. The floorboards creaked with each step, and the scratching instantly stopped. Silence followed a silence, so solid that everyone understood something was definitely there. He pushed one of the crates aside just enough to see beneath it, but the area appeared empty. Yet something caught his eye near the wall, a faint metallic glint. Rick crouched again and found a piece of metal, but it wasn't from any tool he recognized. It was scratched and oddly shaped, worn as if handled hurriedly. When he picked it up, it felt unexpectedly heavy and ice-cold. A strange sensation shot up his arms, like the object carried the remnants of someone else's presence. Suddenly, the windows rattled, as the wind outside intensified. Shadows shifted across the room in unnatural patterns. Rick noticed that one curtain, which had been half-drawn earlier, was now fluttering despite the still air. None of the men had touched it. Their unease grew as they scanned every inch of the room, certain that something unseen was watching them. Rick's eyes moved to the opposite wall. Faint marks had been etched into the wooden panels, deliberate markings that didn't resemble any tool's work. They looked like claw marks, as if something had tried to send a message or leave a warning. A cold chill ran through Rick's body as he stepped closer to study them. Then a hollow knock echoed from deep within the cabin walls, not from outside. Not loud, but unmistakably intentional. The crew flinched. Rick stepped forward again, even though every instinct begged him to stop. Objects around the cabin appeared slightly out of place, a hammer lying far from the workbench. A rope coiled awkwardly. A bucket tipped over at an odd angle. Every detail whispered the same unsettling truth. Someone or something had been inside recently, and it hadn't left through normal means. Rick paused at the center of the cabin, heart pounding. Every clue pointed toward an invisible presence, one patient, deliberate, and waiting. The truth felt close enough to touch, but still hidden. He reached for another crate, sensing that whatever explanation he was searching for lay deeper within the room. But the moment he touched it, the scratching returned closer this time, almost impatient. It grew louder and sharper, echoing across the walls in uneven rhythms. The shadows lengthened, twisting across the floor like they were alive. A sudden creak came from above them. The crew looked up, startled. The sound wasn't random, it was controlled, measured, as if something were moving just out of reach. A cold draft swept through the cabin, brushing the back of Rick's neck like an unseen hand. He shivered, tightened his jacket, and stepped cautiously toward the far wall. A new scent filled the air, metallic and sharp, stronger and harder to ignore. Rick noticed a faint trail on the floorboards, a thin line stretching from the corner, where the scratching had begun. It moved like a winding vein across the room, when he followed it with his eyes. His heartbeat quickened. Another heavy thump came from the ceiling, rhythmic, this time, almost like a pattern being tapped out. The pressure in the room increased, vibrating through the men's bones. Someone whispered, "This isn't normal," but Rick kept staring upward, focusing on every shifting shadow and every sound. Then the shadows moved again quickly, this time gathering near the doorway, as if something had slipped between the walls and the floorboards. Rick stepped forward, cautious and deliberate, even though his mind raced. The scratching now traveled across the ceiling above the loft, circling like a predator, marking territory. His breaths came shallow. The other men stayed close together, too frightened to move. Time stretched uncomfortably. The only noise being their uneven breathing and the restless shifting of shadows. Rick finally looked back at the far wall and froze. Something new had been carved into the wood, something that absolutely had not been there a moment ago. He could see lines carved into the surface, deliberate marks that formed a pattern far too precise for any ordinary tool or human hand. His men would have sworn those markings were meant to be a message, yet the meaning remained completely senseless. A tight twist formed in Rick's stomach, the hairs on his arms rising sharply. Though the room was empty, the heavy feeling of unseen eyes watching him made his pulse stagger. Outside, the wind wailed and slammed against the windows, carrying with it the faint illusion of footsteps that belonged to no one in the cabin. Rick moved a step closer toward the center of the room. He already understood that whatever had created the marks, the sounds, and the shifting shadows was still present. It lingered around them, patient and calculating, studying him and the rest of his crew. The air in the cabin felt strangely alive, thick with tension, as though the entire structure were holding its breath, waiting to reveal something long concealed. He glanced back at his men. Their usual confidence, the bravado they carried into every job, had drained away. Fear stiffened their bodies. None of them dared move because each man sensed that the next step might awaken something they were not prepared to face. The scratch Around them grew sharper, the thumps quicker, and the shadows tightened as if drawn by an invisible force. Something was coming. Rick knew this, in the deepest part of his gut. Whatever had stirred the atmosphere into this trembling unease was ready to show itself. His hand shook as he stepped cautiously toward the far corner of the cabin. The shadows there clung thickly to the walls, curling and twisting in slow motions like smoke trapped in a jar. Everything in him screamed to run, to drag his men out and escape. Yet something stronger, an instinct he could not explain, pulled him forward. The low thumps ceased suddenly, replaced by a faint hum that traveled through the wooden floorboards. It was subtle, nearly impossible to notice unless one was standing perfectly still. Rick crouched, squinting into the dimness. He saw it then, something, partly hidden behind stacked crates and old barrels. There was nothing he recognized. Not a tool, not a piece of equipment, not anything that belonged in a remote mining cabin. The shape was warped and unfamiliar, its form unclear beneath the uneven layer of dust that suggested it had been moved not long ago. Rick's pulse hammered violently. He leaned closer and carefully extended his hand, brushing the edge of the thing. It was cold, and naturally cold, hard, and textured, with a strange material unlike anything he had ever touched. He instantly pulled back. Behind him, the men gathered tightly, their breaths shallow and synchronized in fear. No one attempted to speak. The cabin seemed to swallow every sound except the occasional creak from the roof or the distant gusts slipping through cracked windows. As Rick's eyes adjusted, he began noticing more details. Strange markings ran across the object, scratches and deep grooves, as if someone or something had tried carving symbols into its surface. The lines were chaotic, yet intentional, forming shapes that made no sense to the human mind. Rick leaned even closer, trying to understand, but the symbols resisted comprehension. A sudden metallic clink echoed across the cabin. Every man jumped. Rick turned toward the noise and saw that the crates near the center of the room had shifted slightly, though nothing stood near them. The movement had been deliberate, but by what? His heartbeat pounded so hard it hurt. It felt as though the cabin itself had subtly rearranged itself. Reacting to his discovery, the sense of being watched intensified. Rick reached out again and pulled the object fully into view. It was heavier than it appeared, weighing down his hands like something burdened with history. He felt a strange pressure from it, as if the object retained the energy of whatever last held it. His breath hitched as the realization washed over him. This thing was not ordinary. It was wrong, dangerous, alive in some way he could not rationalize. A whisper brushed through the cabin, not a voice. Not words, but a sound that chilled him to the bone. Rick turned sharply, scanning every shadowed corner, every beam, but nothing was there. Meanwhile, the object lay in his grip, unmoving, yet pulsing with an energy he felt rather than saw. Every instinct screamed at him to drop it and flee, but he remained frozen. One of the men whispered his name, voice trembling. Rick tried to respond, but his throat was tight, the words trapped. His mind had gone blank, consumed entirely by the presence of the object and the oppressive awareness surrounding them. The cabin seemed to shrink inward, the air tightening, as time slowed to a crawl. Then Rick realized something horrifying. The object was only part of a larger story. The marks on the floor, the displaced crates, the faint scratches along the walls. None of it pointed to a single disturbance. There had been multiple movements, multiple presences. Something or several somethings had shaped the room ahead of their arrival. He stepped back, gripping the object firmly. The cabin felt alive now, almost impatient, as if waiting for the next moment. His mind raced while his heart slammed inside his chest. Whatever he held was only the beginning. It had already changed the air around them, changed him. Rick stood frozen, the weight of the object dragging at his trembling hands. His heartbeat was so loud he could hear it echo in his skull. He tried to speak, to ask if the others saw what he did, but the words refused to form. The men stared at him with pale faces, their eyes darting between him and the moving shadows around them. Rick looked out. A faint light from the cracked window caught on the object's edges, revealing carvings he hadn't seen before. Strange grooves twisted across its surface. They weren't letters. They weren't numbers. And as the light shifted, Rick could swear the symbols moved to lay beneath the surface. A cold wave shot through him. He dropped the object. It struck the floor with a hollow thud far too quiet, as if the room absorbed the sound. Rick stepped back. The cabin grew colder. He whipped his head toward the doorway, certain he'd seen movement. Shadows stretched, unnaturally long, across the floor. He blinked hard, but when he looked again, the shadows had shifted closer. His breathing sped up. He reached for the wall, hand trembling violently. His fingers brushed dust on the boards and froze. Another set of fingerprints had disturbed the dust before him. Someone had touched that same spot recently. The whispering behind him grew frantic. Rick couldn't make out words, only the terrified quivering in their voices. His head throbbed, his vision blurred. Then, from the floor, the object emitted a soft hum. The sound was steady, rhythmic like a heartbeat. Everyone went still. The hum grew louder, then abruptly stopped. Rick knew he didn't want to touch it again. but he couldn't look away. A suffocating wrongness filled the cabin, along with the unmistakable sense that this thing had not been meant for them to find. He finally spoke, voice a trembling whisper. "We shouldn't have come here." The words hung like a curse. The men backed away, step by step. Rick didn't move. His hand rose uncertainly toward the object, unsure whether to reach or to recoil. A dim shadow rolled across the room, the light fading as if swallowed. Something inside Rick changed. He felt it. He knew it. When the light returned weak groanly, a dark mark remained where the object had rested. Rick's men fled. The last one out saw Rick kneel at the mark, gripping its edges with shaking hands. When he finally left the cabin, his face looked drained, hollow, almost lifeless. He walked to the truck with stiff, mechanical motions. Nobody dared question him. By sunset, they reached camp. Rick sat apart from the others, staring blankly at nothing. His hands still trembled, as though the weight of the object lingered. When someone asked what he had seen, he uttered only one chilling line. "It's not gone." That was the last. "Clear thing," he said. 4 days. Word spread quickly. Something had happened in that cabin. Something none of the men would talk about. Some claimed Rick hid the object in a steel box inside his truck. Others believed he buried it deep under frozen earth before dawn. No one knew. The men who had been with him withdrew into silence. One abandoned the mining claim entirely. Another vanished before morning. Rick stopped showing up altogether. When someone went to check his cabin, they found the door open. Rick was gone. The light was on, the same light he once refused to use. His radio hummed softly. A chair lay overturned. On the floor was a faint trail, as though something heavy had been dragged. Rumors became legends. People whispered about flickering lights near the ridge, strange vibrations in the ground like a heartbeat beneath the earth, and shadows that moved against the wind. None dared return to the cabin. Weeks passed, then months. The stories grew. Some said the object wasn't metal at all, but something ancient that had waited for Rick. Something that changed him.